Thank you for your interest in my study. My name is Ulises Quintero, and I am a master's student in the Research and Experimental Psychology program at San Jose State University. This is my proposed idea for my master's thesis, and the title of this presentation is How Does Information About Who is Talking Affect What You Hear? So when a speaker talks, they convey multiple sources of information that the listener processes. There are linguistic units, such as words and sentences. However, there are also social demographic characteristics of the talker, such as gender, age, ethnicity, and if they have a non-native accent. Over time, listeners accumulate experiences of how groups of people sound. This leads listeners to create biases and stereotypes about people they've never met, how they might sound. There have been many findings that show that these biases affect what listeners hear. For example, in an experiment conducted by the researcher Donald Rubin, he presented students with an audio recording. Along with the audio recording, he showed them one of two images, one representing a native English speaker and one representing a non-native English speaker. Despite hearing the same audio recording, the face representing the native English speaker was found to be more comprehensible and less accented than the face of the non-native English speaker. This shows that biases affect social demographic characteristics of a listener. However, existing work has not examined how listeners' language background moderates this effect. So for our research question, we are interested in seeing to what extent does listeners' language background affect perceptions of what they hear. More specifically, how does listeners' exposure to non-native accented speech affect their biases towards non-native accented speakers? More specifically, how do these biases affect the extent to which they rate speakers' comprehensibility and accentedness? So for our hypothesis, we want to know how do listeners' rating of speaker accentedness and comprehensibility will be moderated by the amount of exposure that listeners have to non-native accented speech. This means we expect listeners with more exposure to non-native accented speech who will perceive the speaker to be more comprehensible and less accented than listeners with less exposure to non-native accented speech. This will be an online study where we will recruit 75 students from San Jose State. They will hear 36 sentences in American English spoken by a male speaker. They will transcribe what they hear, and along they will rate each sentence on perceived accentedness on a 1 through 7 scale. Along with the auditory stimuli, participants will see one of three faces. One, the face on the left representing the native English speaker, the face in the middle representing the non-native English speaker, and the face on the right representing our control. After completing the task, participants will complete a questionnaire assessing their language background and number of hours per week that they're exposed to non-native accented English. For our anticipated results, we're expected to see that listeners with more exposure to non-native accented English will have higher comprehension and lower accentedness than listeners who have had less exposure to non-native accented English. And by this, we mean on the graph on the left, we see transcription accuracy on the y-axis and exposure to non-native accented speech on our x. We expect for the face representing the non-native English speaker with more exposure, the transcription accuracy increases. For our face representing the native English speaker and our control, we expect that their accuracy to remain constant as exposure increases. For accentedness, we have accentedness ratings on the y-axis, and we have exposure to non-native accented speech on our x-axis. We expect that the face representing the non-native English speaker to have lower accentedness ratings as their exposure to non-native accented speech increases. For our control and the face representing the native English speaker, we expect that their ratings to remain constant over time. If our hypotheses are met, this will provide evidence that listeners' exposure towards different speakers and groups of speakers plays an important role in the formation of biases that affect what a listener hears. In addition, we'll show that language processing is a dynamic process that includes both bottom-up and top-down processing. And by this, we mean that listeners track group-specific variation and use this to guide their listening. In addition, accumulated experience with speakers and groups of speakers leads listeners to form expectations of what they might hear, moderating the listening process. So for future directions, we are interested in seeing how might listeners perceive non-native accented English if they believe they are hearing a native English speaker. In addition, we also want to know how might perceived comprehensibility of a talker, for example, asking how easy the talker is to understand, differs from actual speech comprehension, such as transcription. Lastly, we are also interested in seeing how would a listener's perceptions change if social demographic information about the speaker is presented more explicitly at the start of the experiment.